there are things that make me lose my cool. When I'm getting ready to teach a class on Zoom, and I have all my students in front of me from far and wide, and the internet goes down, in that moment that I'm beginning to speak, I lose my cool. When my children would fight with each other, and wasn't often, but in looking back, that's when I could lose my cool. To see my children hurting each other, that's an emotional button. But the one time I most distinctly remember losing my cool, and I shared this the other night at a dinner, is that I was at a parent-teacher conference with my daughter. She was probably in 5th grade. And she got a very poor grade in prayer, a C-. And I said to the teacher, my daughter hasn't gotten bad grades in any of her subjects for behavior except for prayer. How come you gave her a C-? And she said, well, she's the rabbi's daughter, and she talks. Well, that was my button. I slammed on the table, and it was a public setting, and I said, how dare you treat my daughter differently than anybody else? I don't have a problem, really, as a parent, hearing about the need for my children to improve. But hearing my child treated differently than other children, that was like, you don't go there. That's just not fair. Now here's where I'm going with this sharing. Tomorrow's Torah reading begins with words, contains words that are at the very beginning of our service tomorrow morning. Page 101, the morning prayers start with words many of us know, Ma tovu aholecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. Remarkably, the first words that we say when we enter a synagogue are words in the Bible. That's not surprising. But the surprising part is they're words by somebody who was not Jewish, not of the Israelite community. They were words of a prophet who was hired to curse Israel. And remarkably, rather than a curse, blessing emerged. And a lovely teaching that I take to heart is that when we echo the words of Ma Tovu, we're challenged to say to ourselves, if somebody was entering from outside of our community into our space, would they bless us? Would they see us worthy of being blessed? And that's how the rabbis in the Talmud understand, in part, what triggered a curse becoming a blessing. The rabbis will teach in the Talmud that as Bilam looked out over the tents of the Israelites, he saw modesty. No tent door faced another tent door, that people had a sense of needing to be circumspect in how they lived their lives. And he was so impressed with their modesty, their humility, curse became blessing. And so the teaching that I've said and teaching through the years is that we need to live lives worthy of being blessed, worthy of being seen by others as blessing. And I still think that's very important. For each of us, for ourselves, we need to hold ourselves to high standards, to try and be our best. But that's very different than people judging us by a double standard. And when the people I love are judged by a double standard, when my family is judged differently than other people, I can lose my cool. I have lost my cool in recent weeks. And one of my Psalm students from England who participates really on that Zoom teaching of Psalms had an exchange with her about anti-Semitism in England. It's the wonderful thing about Zoom. She can be in England and doesn't miss a class. And she, who's a leader in the Jewish and interfaith community in England, has informed me about how extreme the Anglican Church has been in judging Israel by a double standard and how it's acceptable in public discourse to speak of Israel in the most negative ways. And so in recent weeks, when I've turned on John Oliver or Trevor Noah, comedian news people that I have liked, and they say in the midst of the battle that Israel is facing with an enemy shelling through missiles, when they say, it's all very complicated, and I don't want to get in the complication. All I know is there's a lot more Palestinians dying than in Israelis, and it looks cruel, and Israel is cruel. I say to myself as I watch that, but the details do matter. And to say it's complicated and I don't want to deal with it, and therefore the big guy, or what looks like the big guy, is to be condemned for having a defense system, I'm not all right with that. When I watched Nora Roberts in CBS Evening News, which was Linda and my favorite evening news, reporting on that skirmish, and what happened night after night were the same buildings falling down, and then the voiceover. It reminded me of those TV commercials for medications where they have the picture of the couple that looks very happy, and then they tell you of all the dangerous side effects. But who's listening to the side effects? You're looking at the beautiful image. This is the flip side. This is the flip side, where they're showing the planes attacking, and then they're telling you in the voiceover about how, yes, there were missiles fired. And it was done consistently night after night. I am troubled that the Republican candidate for mayor in New York, Silwa, can say to the community in his campaigning, the Jews are going to try and take over your neighborhood, and that he is not ruled out of order. If he had said that about African Americans, if he had said that about Hispanics, if he had said that about Asian Americans, he would be out of the race. And it's the Jews' fault as well as everybody else, because what I have seen, and my little teaching here is going to end happy, and it's very short. I don't know where the happy is yet, but it'll get there. But what I'm aware of on college campuses up close regarding Israel is that Jews are afraid to speak out. Jewish faculty is afraid to speak out. I didn't know it viscerally till more recently when I've heard it from people that I am close to. It's the reality. And my student Irene challenged me this week by an email, and she said, Rabbi, are you speaking about this? Because I said, I know it's in England and I'm concerned it's growing in America. She said, Rabbi, are you speaking about it? I said, not enough. So tonight I'm making up a little bit. Only to say, I have no problem with people criticizing my children when they're misbehaving. That's fair conversation. What's not fair is doing it to them differently than anybody else, to shame my children. That's not fair. Or to judge them by another standard than you would judge other kids that you deal with in your class. That's not right. Israel matters because it's part of my family. It's part of my collective identity. And if Israel's judged, if the LA Unified can be saying that we're going to boycott Israel and only Israel, that's not all right. Not that everything Israel's doing is right. There can be conversation. But double standards and treating us differently is not all right. It pushes my buttons. And I hope it pushes your buttons. And we need to write about it. We need to speak out about it. We need not to be afraid. Alan Dershowitz, whose reputation is dynamic, he wrote a book called Chutzpah. And what remained on his book of Chutzpah, he said, when Jews feel like second-class citizens, that's when they're afraid to speak out the way anybody else would speak out if their community was challenged. We need to speak out because we're first-class citizens, because this is our home. And we should not be shy of saying, this is a double standard. And so the happy ending. We can share that. A little sadness. Churches don't have walls around them and security guards. That's the fear of the right. There's a fear on the left. My teacher, Yitz Greenberg, said regarding movements, you should be ashamed of whatever movement you belong to. If you identify with the right, you should be ashamed. If you identify with the left, you should be ashamed. There's enough to go around. And so the happiness is we all have reason to fear, we all have reason to be a little ashamed, and we all have reason to be hopeful. Hopeful that we live in an amazing time and an amazing place in which this kind of concern can be shared publicly and in which each of us has the ability to act. Ribono Shalom, Master of the universe, may we harvest, may we know we are blessed, may we hear the words of Matovu, knowing that we are both worthy of blessing and more, that we should see ourselves with the responsibility to be worthy, and may so we be blessed. Amen.